Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, Columbia University professor and FP columnist, is with us. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, today we have just one data point for you, and that is 3.4%. That is the current rate of inflation in the United States, which still qualifies as elevated, if only mildly so.
Inflation remains well above the Fed's 2% target rate and does not support the view that the Federal Reserve will begin cutting rates anytime
I think what this means is people still feel pretty lousy about affordability. These numbers don't change that, at least at the household level, just yet. 3.4%, 0.3% month over month. Those are still hotter than the Fed would like to see.
And let's talk
Generally, that high inflation plus the associated economic discontent in the United States and the general atmosphere of political instability, the growing political radicalism represented by Donald Trump's leadership of the Republican Party, even threats of political violence associated with that. All of that has kindled comparison between the present-day United States and Weimar Germany, which was another democracy in Germany in the period between World War I and World War II, or rather, between World War I and the rise of the Nazi dictatorship. That brief democratic period also famously had high inflation, and eventually it collapsed into outright dictatorship. So we thought we'd dig into the economics of Weimar Germany and consider where exactly the analogy with the United States lines up and doesn't line up, for that matter. I should add, this idea came from a listener, so thanks to Nick Page for suggesting the idea. Adam, just to start off, with a basic question that often comes up when this comparison is made, was inflation the core reason for Weimar Germany's political instability?
I think the short answer is no, but let me go at that in a more constructive way. What is certainly true, if you flip this on its head, is that political instability was the core reason for Weimar's inflation, because inflation is the product, essentially, of political indecision in the case of the Weimar Republic, or the choice of inflation as the least worst option in a world of very bad options. In the aftermath of World War I, it was a country teetering on the edge of civil war. It faced enormous external reparations demands, the costs of the war at home, a very fragile and new political system that had little experience of brokering the essential compromises that hold a democratic capitalist society together. And the modern interpretation of the Weimar hyperinflation is that they chose to avoid the tough decisions on fiscal policy, taxing and spending, that would have been necessary to stabilize the currency for a long time, until the inflation in 1923 really becomes so disastrous that taking action is better than continuing with the slide into worse and worse inflation. The consequences of that were grievous, in that they left, as it were, a legacy of resentment on the part of people that felt as though they were the losers of the inflation. The biggest losers in quantitative terms were, in the final stages, workers themselves, but they did relatively better earlier on because they had bargaining power, organized in trade unions. Farmers, likewise, who could produce things, could be sold. In quantitative terms, the biggest losers are the richest people who have monetary assets in large numbers that get burned off. So one of the things that's going on here is the war debt is being evaporated. But in relative terms, and in terms of the degree of pain suffered, it's the middle class that really does very badly and feels the pain. People in white-collar jobs with small savings that aren't very diversified, don't have large portfolios of real assets, don't have control of the means of production. These sorts of people do very badly. And that does shift the complexion of German politics. In particular, it fosters, as the work of Gerald Feldman, amongst others, showed, anti-Semitism, various types of conspiracy theory about how this disaster unfolded. It fosters a great antagonism towards France, whose invasion of the Ruhr in 1923 precipitated the final descent into disaster, because the German government called for passive resistance and then funded it. So they paid for large parts of the German economy not to work, so as to refuse coal to the French. So there are these burning hatreds which were fostered in 23. But the essential point to make is that it's not inflation but deflation that brings the Weimar Republic down. Right? So the Weimar Republic in the late 20s showed signs of having stabilized. And it isn't that situation which produces the huge vote for the Nazis by 1932, and the Nazis in the 28 election are sub 3%. They're a relatively trivial presence in German politics. It's the deflation, it's the Great Depression, it's downward movement of prices. It's a 30% fall in wholesale prices, a 20% fall in retail prices, slashes to wages, the bankruptcy, which is not a phenomenon you get in an inflation, because inflations are good for debtors and bad for creditors. Deflations are good for creditors and terrible for debtors. Debtors tend to be weaker parties in economic terms, so they invoke bankruptcy to escape. That brings down the German banking system in 1931. And it's that really that sets the stage for the Nazi seizure of power, not the war of all against all class struggle of the early 20s, which is the classic driver of inflation, interest groups battering each other for the slices of a pie. But if you like, the kind of collapse of power, the vacuum of power, into which then what is in many ways a sort of simulacrum and a virtual civil war party, which is what the Nazi party is in the early 1930s. It's not an actual civil war party. It's dudes reenacting the struggles of the early 20s in street fighting, is then hoisted into power by conservative elites who've run out of other options in 1933. So it's important to emphasize this, because in German popular memory, and we know this from opinion polling, the German public commonly believes that the Weimar Republic ended amidst a giant bonfire of monetary values, and it's just not true. The Weimar Republic survived the inflation. In fact, the inflation was a way of surviving the immediate aftermath of World War I. It cost and it burned huge scars into German society, no doubt. But it's actually the deflation which tips German democracy into total dysfunction and destroys it.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask about this, the role that public imagination plays when considering inflation in our day as well. I mean, I'm curious whether, it's simply, first of all, a category mistake to compare our recent bout of inflation with hyperinflation of the kind we were just talking about in Weimar Germany. I mean, are these just economically just essentially different phenomenon entirely? And then I'm curious, why has the moderately elevated inflation we've seen in recent years then been so politically unpopular? I mean, you talked about the groups that benefit from inflation, and this is even coming, amid the time when incomes in the United States, at least statistically, have risen to compensate for the increase in prices. So is the kind of unpopularity of this phenomenon itself the product of an ideological shift since the days of Weimar Germany?
Yes, I think your point about category mistake is, I think that's a great way of putting it. Hyperinflations are crazy phenomena. In the German case, the currency devalued by a factor of a million. So, total worthlessness. It's the fourth worst, if ever, inflation. The three that are worst were in Yugoslavia, Zimbabwe, and Hungary. So it was devastating. The effect of this is that prices double every couple of days. In the very worst hyperinflation ever in Hungary, they doubled every 15 hours. So it's a world removed. And one of the crucial things about a hyperinflation is that you see a flight out of money as such. So it's not just that prices change and that over the long run it's worth investing in real assets as opposed to monetary assets. You see a collapse of the monetary system as such. Money itself just becomes this massively depreciating object that you have to get rid of as quickly as possible. So you see people moving out of conventional money into money alternatives. In the monetary economics, there's this idea of the velocity of money, which is the speed with which it circulates. The same banknote will serve many different people as a means of exchange. In an inflation, the velocity of circulation skyrockets because people don't want to hold on to this rapidly depreciating asset. That's hyperinflation. What we've witnessed recently, as we discussed a while back now, I'm even skeptical about that we should call it inflation at all, because an inflation is a general surge in prices, and the lopsided way in which prices moved in recent years is the most striking thing about those price movements, particularly in Europe, where it was really an exogenous shock, largely driven by energy prices and basically a terms of trade shift rather than a general movement of prices. What the central bankers were worried about was that a price shock would become a general move of prices. And one of the prices that would need to move to make it really general would be the wage, because in economics terms, a wage is simply the price of labor. And one of the reasons I think this recent so-called inflation has been as unpopular as it is was that in many cases the wages didn't adjust. And so the wage price spiral that many people expected from classic inflations like those in the 70s, or at least notionally those in the 70s, retrospective history has shown that wage price spirals are much rarer than we imagine. They didn't happen. And so in Europe, real wages just fell. Prices rose, some prices rose, largely externally driven prices rose. There was some profit taking as well by companies that took advantage of the situation, and real wages fell. It's not surprising, therefore, that people feel aggrieved. And the trade-off, if you like, if the trade-off is imagined between inflation and unemployment, which is one of the ways we tend to think of macro policy, then unemployment afflicts a small and relatively unlucky group of people. In sociological terms, it's almost always the weakest people in the labor market, migrant workers, or in the American case, it's black workers that are affected most, black men in particular. Whereas inflation affects everyone, and that makes it unpopular. It is less damaging to everyone if people are powerfully represented by trade unions and collective actors that can defend their interests and force their price to go up too. And that collective bargaining strength is relatively weak in the current moment. And so what instead happens is some prices go up, not all, including not wages. And so there are these real income hits. And unsurprisingly, then the entire process is very, very unpopular. I think that's the easiest way to explain it. It hasn't reached the stage. In an earlier period, you would have said that inflation is instability and class conflict, and that's what's unpopular amongst conservative folk who don't like to see the bases of society contested. But since there was so, relatively speaking, in most countries, Britain might actually be an exception because there was actually a very large wave of militancy associated with the so-called cost of living crisis. But in general, we didn't see much of that in Europe. Germany, again, might be somewhat different because there's been a substantial wave of industrial protests here as well. But I don't think that by itself explains the distaste for inflation. It's this cost of living effect, which has been tough.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break right here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about Weimar Germany. So to turn back to Weimar proper, I mean, I'm curious, how did liberals and technocrats at the time navigate just the turmoil and chaos of Weimar politics? I mean, I'm hoping maybe there are lessons that can be drawn from that. I mean, did the liberals and technocrats, did they get political credit for stopping the hyperinflation that we were just talking about? Or did kind of politics just reach such an inflection point beyond which liberals were unable to compete anymore democratically on their preferred terms with the more radical elements in politics? I mean, did the liberals have to become more kind of populist in turn amid this period in Weimar?
Yeah, this is it's a topic very dear to my heart. I effectively wrote 2 books about this question. One about the German Statistical Office, which were a group of German technocrats who didn't start out a liberal but ended up essentially siding with the Nazis by the 1930s, and then Deluge about the dilemmas of liberal politics in this period. And I mean, historically speaking, this is the period in which the modern notion of technocracy and the modern notion of liberalism actually both emerge, really, in the forms we would recognize today. And somebody like John Maynard Keynes is a paradigmatic figure of this period, perhaps the most famous economist ever up to that point because of his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And yes, the money doctors, the men who fixed the German hyperinflation, Hans Luther, the politician, and then Hjalmar Schacht, the central banker, are actually very famous. They become sort of rock stars of the economic policy scene. And the stabilization is painful. It's tough. All inflationary stabilizations are certainly big ones because they involve real redistributive choices. You have to raise taxes, cut spending, and you do deflate the economy hard, which is what they did in 1924. But whilst that could be presented as conducive to the emergence of a new international order, securely anchored not just inside Germany, but within a liberal international economic order, and specifically one anchored in Europe on the British Empire and the City of London, and then even more importantly on the United States, Wall Street, and banks like JP Morgan, no one placed much hope in American politicians after the profound disappointment with Woodrow Wilson and the way that Congress sabotaged the League of Nations. But American money really mattered, and engineers like Henry Ford were very inspiring, or business people like Henry Ford, we should probably say, were very inspiring to contemporary Europeans. That model of sort of a liberal internationalist future legitimated from the outside the stabilization of the Weimar Republic in a very important way. And did the same in Japan, actually, in the 1920s. There's a brand of Japanese centrist, technocratic, liberal, in inverted commas, that are bought in on this vision. You have Gustav Stresemann, who's the quintessential ex-nationalist imperialist, peace prize winning advocate of détente and diplomacy in the 1920s, even goes into a sort of Francis Fukuyama post-historical mode where he says, what is it that people will want to do in the future? They will want commerce, obviously, and money, and the dollar will rule. But beyond that, it'll be sport, Champions League, soccer, and science. Nobel Prizes will be the thing that people will compete for. So a kind of post-historic vision, the forces of violence will be calmed by sensible economic management. Austerity, in that sense, restoring stability at the end of the inflation, was a guarantee of civility and of disarmament, because the main drivers of inflation were obviously the militarists and war. And so if you could stabilize the world, create a zone for commerce, sort of do commerce, science and civilization to flourish, then the world would stabilize. And you can see where this is going. What destroys this, and this is the point I was making earlier on about inflation and the future of the Weimar Republic, is not the early 20s inflation, but the Great Depression after 1929, when all of those international threads snap and break. And it's really the sense that Germany's cut adrift, also the same in Japan, that Japan's cut adrift and is now just going to have to face the awesome pressures of global geopolitics. In the Japanese case, China, Russia, the United States, that precipitates Japanese militarists into very aggressive policy in China. And you can see something analogous in Germany with nationalist, militarist solutions emerging, even amongst people who'd previously been internationalist, as better options. A company like IG Farben, which becomes notorious, this giant chemicals company that becomes notorious for collaborating with the Nazis, how does it end up there? It's a classic German international corporation in the 1920s. And what makes the difference, what flicks the switch, is the Great Depression. Because at that moment, you realize no more money from the US, no more access to global markets, and no global hegemon. So then everyone has to kind of look out for themselves. And so nationalist politics locally and parties which appear to be able to deliver popular mass bases for strong national action, in other words, fascist parties, seem much more attractive, even to elites who, in principle, really don't have any real affinity for their politics, but need them as mechanisms for generating mass support.
So I guess for me, this raises the question of, what would an alternative 20th century history be in which, austerity doesn't get imposed in Weimar Germany, and then the democratic system doesn't collapse? I mean, is there a kind of conceivable alternative of that kind? I mean, what are other ways that the political tensions in the country, which were so deep that you're describing, I mean, what are the other ways those could have been resolved? I mean, was a civil war of some kind then inevitable? I mean, what could you sketch there, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, a civil war happened in Germany at a low level between the collapse of the imperial order, the monarchy, in the fall of 1918 through to 1923 with the Hitler putsch and the communist putsch in central Germany. Germany for 5 years lives through civil war conditions. And in the early stages of this, in 1919 and 1920, we're talking about pitched battles between armies of tens of thousands of men with artillery and armored cars and airplanes, even in some cases, flamethrowers. The whole works being deployed around Dachau, for instance, or in the struggles in the Ruhr in the 1920s, where a Red Guard, a revolutionary communist army, established itself and was repressed by the soldiers and the paramilitaries of the right. So Germany did have a civil war. Many more people were killed in it. Thousands of people were killed in it than eventually in the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, which became ultra-violent after the Nazis had seized power. But before that was more like casual brawls on corners in Berlin. A couple of guys would get killed every week. In the early Weimar Republic, it was a real civil war situation. One thesis, it's Neil Ferguson's, pet project, the conservative commentator, economic historian. His PhD actually runs the counterfactual in which authoritarianism comes to Germany early. So his idea is there could have been a right-wing putsch in 1920. If the Cat putsch, one of the early right-wing putschs that succeeded, he fantasizes, they could have stabilized, conducted the disinflationary policy, avoided the damage of the hyperinflation. So Germany might, if you like, have headed down more like a Mussolini route. So an authoritarian, maybe even fascist regime, but not Hitler. And it takes somebody like Neil Ferguson to come up with like a fantasy like this, but it's it's a vivid idea. It's an interesting idea. So you avoid the worst of the slide into chaos by curtailing democracy earlier and therefore escape it. Once you come out the other side of that, if you assume that Germany really does go down the path that it did through the mid-20s, then I think all of the counterfactuals now are about the external constraints. There used to be a big debate amongst Keynesians in Germany, West Germany in particular, about whether or not the last governments of the Weimar Republic could have avoided deflation and done a Keynesian demand stimulus. But I think most people agree that that's quite unrealistic, given that Germany was part of the gold standard, was hugely weighed down with debts which were denominated in foreign currency. So if Germany had left the gold standard, it would have been a crushing bankruptcy. Everything hinges really, and this is the nub of my work on this period, on American hegemony. Like, it's the fact that the Americans and the British screw up the management of the newly established gold standard from the mid-1920s, and in particular the utterly counterproductive American policies of that moment, which are lending money and imposing tariffs, hiking interest rates at the wrong moments, allowing the American money supply to implode. Like, it's about as badly managed as any global system has been. And you see it in America's own economic data. The only country with an even worse Great Depression than Germany is the United States, which is notionally at the hub of the whole system. Like, if you have hegemony as badly managed as that, then really there's no saving the Weimar Republic, which is dependent entirely on the United States to a degree that isn't really recognized, because we think of West Germany as being America's satellite. The Weimar Republic was to a degree dependent on the United States at a period when, of course, America wasn't in the habit of or recognizing global hegemonic politics as part of its calling. In fact, there was a resistance on the part, and not to speak in terms of the old-fashioned language of isolationism. But that's what we're talking about, the refusal of Congress to cut deals on anything that would have enabled the Europeans to escape the impasse that they were in. So it's pretty difficult to construct an alternative, but that's, I think, the way I would go. Not domestic German conditions, but external factors, and the US is very much then at the center of the conversation.
So finally, I guess I wanted to ask whether the people of Weimar Germany at the time, whether they knew they were living in an existentially unstable time. I ask because this analogy being drawn with today, obviously the situations are very different, but there is a sense of instability, of anxiety around politics in the United States in particular. And I guess I'm curious how much we should credit our own feelings of anxiety about our politics today. Did the Germans at that time have a sense of collapse being really just around the corner?
This is a really central question for social and political historians of the period. And I think one important thing to say is, many listeners will know, the famous pictures of the Weimar Republic. You see them in the MoMA or any other art gallery, like of George Grosz or Otto Dix or Beckmann, these expressionist, distorted, grotesque images of the Weimar Republic. I think there were probably bits of, Babylon Berlin, that show that was on Netflix. Like, there were bits of Berlin that were genuinely like that. There's no doubt at all. It's a pretty sordid city, even at the best of times. So that definitely is a fact. But it's also clearly the case that the vast majority of Germans did not live in a Weimar cabaret full of transvestites and, people carrying on. That definitely was not their scene. The vast majority of Germans lived in provincial cities and carried on relatively standard, mundane lives, which is why the three big shocks of the World War, which was a total war, which kills and maimed millions of people and subjected huge numbers to extraordinary trauma, which many of them kind of survived and walked on and married. Men have remarkable capacities for digesting this kind of stuff. Then the hyperinflation, which destroys everyone's money. And then on top of that, within 10 years, the collapse of the economy is such that you have 6 million unemployed and hordes of desperate men marching around the country in search of jobs. It's not grapes of wrath in the American sense, because there's no Dust Bowl in Germany. But nevertheless, you do have the same phenomenon of giant encampments of homeless people. It takes those three things to really unhinge German politics. And it does. In due course, by 32, a majority of Germans are voting for parties which basically have an apocalyptic view of the future, whether it's Nazi or communist. So a city like Berlin, the biggest party is the Communist Party by 1932, which is promising a different kind of radical alternative. And it's not for nothing that, the folks that interest you and me from the point of view of political theory and intellectual history fish in these waters too. It's not for nothing that the Weimar Republic is the generator of so much radical thought, whether you're thinking about Heidegger or Walter Benjamin or the Frankfurt School, or there's an entire intellectual community that is struggling to make sense of this truly profound upheaving of the foundations of modern society. Yes, I think it's fair to say that they did know this, and it's against that backdrop that a politics, as when it's fully spelled out, and a lot of the time, of course, Nazism didn't actually spell out that it was intending to hurl Germany into another total war in pursuit of a life and death existential struggle against world Jewry. That wasn't actually what they campaigned on. But as the regime developed and expanded its program and indoctrinated the Hitler Youth, the Hitler Youth slogan was literally, "We were born to die for Germany." That was what every middle school boy was like, joined the Boy Scouts with that as its slogan. It's a period which mobilizes a extraordinarily radical vision of history in its wake. And liberalism does indeed. It's not void of answers, and I think this is a common cliche which isn't very helpful at all. Liberalism has plenty of answers, so does social democracy. But they are contending with politics which offers truly radical visions of the future, such that by the end of World War II, Finis Germaniae, the end of Germany, and if you went to a place like Dortmund and saw it, having been essentially, you could say, quote unquote, nuked by repeated conventional bombing, it kind of was a reality of total destruction, from which then Germany recovers with remarkable speed and intensity and completeness. But yeah, no, it is a moment where radical alternatives open in a way that seldom has happened in Western history in the modern period.
Yeah, I suppose that raises the question of, when we have our anxieties today about our politics, how we can differentiate anxieties that are maybe, narcissistic versus those that are actually reflecting catastrophic circumstances. I'm not sure there's a method for that.
Well, I think that the best method is this sort of weird combination of historical comparison, argument, contextualization. It depends also very much from what point of view I think you view it. Like the fascism question, maybe we should do it. I don't know, have we done an episode already about fascism? We should do one maybe.
Well, I think we have. But yeah.
Maybe we need to come back to it, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Been impending events in November. Maybe a refresher on the fascism question would be cool for.
That sounds like it could be useful. We still have a few months until this election, and so I'm sure we'll have occasion to return to this topic. But again, for now, thanks to Nick Page for suggesting the topic, and otherwise we will be back next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.